Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Underwater Photography Show. As always, I'm Matthew Sullivan.
And I'm Alex Mustard.
And as you can see, I am still in this bare white room. I'm here for a couple more weeks. So come August, I'll be back in my little home studio for a bit.
You
But
could
for
just
now,
buy a
please bear
green
with me.
sheet in the meantime.
Yeah, good. But for now, bear with me. I know the lighting isn't the best, and my white wall isn't as aesthetically pleasing as my normal Springs background. But hopefully you guys are listening to us talk about underwater stuff anyway, instead of worrying about what we look like. So today we're going to have a discussion about customizing your cameras and housings for underwater shooting. And this doesn't mean like adding ball mounts here and there. This is like adding custom, like setting custom buttons and custom functions on your camera and then housing. A bunch of people have messaged me about this. I'm sure Alex has gotten a lot of questions over the years about this as well. So we're going to talk about that today, and hopefully this is useful to people with regards to streamlining their underwater shooting and maybe some helpful shortcuts.
Yeah, when I first went over to Sony and I knew a lot of people were interested in that, I made a couple of videos that just sit on my YouTube channel, which is full of boring stuff. But on that channel, the video has actually been very popular, and so many people have found it useful. Before we get into any specifics, I think the word of warning I would send out to anyone is customizing your housing is not the key to getting magically better photos. And I think sometimes we can feel that we're missing a trick because we know our cameras have so many buttons that are customizable. And surely if we can get exactly the right settings, suddenly our pictures are going to be way better. Customization is only really there to improve the ergonomics, improve the usability of the camera. And Sony and Nikon and Canon and Olympus and whoever else out there have spent a long time thinking about how your camera should be laid out. So it isn't the case that you need to make loads and loads and loads of changes, particularly for underwater shooting. But I think there are some things that we can customize that do make sense photographically, and that's what we want to cover in this. But I would encourage you to not fiddle about with your camera all the time. If you have made customizable changes and you hear us and go, oh, I should redo it, okay, consider doing that. But if you're constantly changing it, you're always going to make the ergonomics worse. The ergonomics are about your camera feeling second nature to you, and the more you mess about with it, the less familiar it's going to feel. However, if there are important things that you can do to your housing that will put the buttons that you really need access to regularly right at your fingertips, then I think that is a really valuable thing to do.
Like you said, avoiding overcomplication. I only have 3 custom settings set on my A1, and I think the A1 has like 4 or 5 like custom buttons you can set. So I only have 3 of them set. I have one set for to bring up white balance quickly. I have one set to change from single point autofocus to, I think, whatever the wide or zone is. And then the one that I use most frequently is actually to change into like the crop sensor. So the A1 has 50 megapixels. The crop sensor resolution, I think, is still 22 or 23 or something like that, which I'm not selling big prints. I'm not usually selling magazines. So I don't necessarily worry about the resolution. And it's a nice way to get a tighter picture without necessarily having to get close. Or if you've maxed out your focus distance and then you just punch into the crop sensor, you can get a smaller frame from that without necessarily having to crop afterward. I don't like having to crop afterward, so it just saves me an extra step, just hitting a lever in the water. And that one I use kind of all the time.
Yeah, I know several people who really like that feature. For me,
Yeah.
I don't have that on a custom setting. I see no reason to ever shoot my camera on crop sensor mode. If it needs to be cropped, I'll crop it afterwards. But I know, particularly the contest photographers, they love it because they're shooting, and a lot of contests have rules about no cropping. But if you crop when shooting, so your raw file is already cropped, that's absolutely fine. So I can completely understand why people want to have access to that.
So the most frequent time I use it is when I shoot my Canon 50 mil behind the curve port, because it only goes to 1:2. It doesn't do 1:1. So there are some times where I'm shooting something a little bit smaller, and I just need to, and I don't, like I said, I don't want to have to crop afterward. So I'll just hit the that single custom. I have it set on a lever. Hit that little custom lever, and it punches it in real quick. And then it's it's much easier to shoot a dwarf frogfish when I have it on the crop sensor than trying to do it with a lens
Yeah,
that doesn't
no.
actually focus that closely.
Yeah, no. I was going to jump back in time first of all, and I grabbed my Subal D5 housing out, which is a big old beast if I hold it up here in the middle. And I was going to talk about one of the customizations. One of the first, for a while, cameras weren't very customizable. But a few of the things that I would say I set on this as a sort of more basic setup, I think shows the beginning of my thought process. One of the buttons that you can press, that you can set on most of the cameras, is so that whenever you press any of the buttons on the camera, they stay pressed. For example, if you need to press a button to adjust ISO, if you have to press and hold that and then turn a lever to change ISO on a camera, that can be quite fiddly. So one of the early customizations a lot of underwater photographers do is to have that setting set in the cameras. The different companies call it different things, but that's a very good setting to set. One of the things that I did on this housing is Subal put this little lever here above the shutter release. So if I hold it in the middle, this one here is the shutter release, and on the Subal it's always set so you take the pictures with your middle finger. With your index finger. I'm getting confused on my finger naming, but on your second finger. And your first finger wiggles around in the air like this. But there's actually a lever on this housing above that. And that lever connects to the two function buttons on the front of the Nikon SLRs. And by pulling that button back, it presses the lower of those two buttons, I think. And I've set that lower button to be flash off. And I find that a really valuable feature. And it's not a very common option for custom settings on cameras. But Nikon have always had it. Sony don't have it, annoyingly. And I think it's a really nice feature. So when I was shooting with the old D5, I could shoot away with this button. If I wanted to shoot a silhouette suddenly, all I would do is just pull back on both my first two fingers. Pulling that second finger back would pull this lever back as well. And that would just shut my flash guns off. And that was such a nice feature to have on the housing. And I think things like that can be really, really useful to have on the camera. Now, I can't do that on my Sony, so I've gone down different routes. But on this camera, that was such a lovely feature to be able to shoot flash off. So it's really a case of, I think, examining what you feel would be useful to you in your photography and making those changes. So the adjustments that I've got on my Sony housing, I haven't got space on the desk to have them both here, is, first of all, I never shoot video. But on most housings, the video record button is a really well-placed ergonomic lever. So I think that's a really good thing to customize. If you never shoot video, which the majority of stills photographers never shoot video on their camera rigs, then you might as well be using that really nicely placed ergonomic lever for something important. So on my Sony, I have that lever set to be face detection or subject detection, subject recognition, whatever it's called on the different cameras, to be on off. So I have that on a toggle on off. So if I'm shooting macro and I have face detection on, and suddenly it's a butterfly fish and the eye detection goes to the eye spot on the tail of the butterfly fish rather than its face, I can just tap that lever, it turns face detection off, and it goes back to normal autofocus. And I find that's a really handy one to have there.
Yeah.
On my Sony, I have the two custom buttons on the top of the camera. I think they're called C1 and C2. Those are both running autofocus for me because autofocus menus are a bit buried on the Sony and you want to be able to access them quickly. So one of those brings up the menu so I can navigate through it and choose whichever one I want quickly. The other one toggles through the menu. And depending on where I am in the menu, depends how much I want to toggle, which one is faster to use. But generally I use the front one of the two, which is the toggle one. And I just go, dug, 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 dug. Okay, I'm in the focus mode I want. And I carry on shooting. And I have that set to toggle through all the modes. If I press the other one, it brings up the menu on the side of the EVF, and I can just scroll up and down and bring up the one I want. The other custom settings that I've got on that camera is most people set up their mirrorless cameras and for the viewfinder. And so the custom buttons on the left-hand side is kind of widely used by most underwater photographers to toggle between using the EVF and the viewfinder. Now, if you never use the EVF because you haven't invested in a big optical viewfinder, you may want to use that conveniently placed button for something else. But I like using it for that. And then I think beyond that, I don't think I've done too many other big changes, because ultimately it's about keeping it simple, keeping it there ready for you. Without the camera here, I can't think of any others. I think I have got the white balance button set on the other function button, but I hardly ever change white balance during the dive. The other customization that was important for me with my Sony was to make sure that the function menu, which is what happens when you press FN on the back of the housing, comes up for stills photography, because that's what I do, and the My menu have all the stuff that I use a lot in. And I think I basically put as much of the same stuff there. So I know that in my FN menu, I've got the ability to switch between electronic and mechanical shutter. I've got in that menu the ability to turn wireless flash on or off, depending on the flash triggers I'm using. I've got flash mode in there. I've got picture mode in there. So if I want to suddenly start shooting black and white, that's in there too. And I think I've got the live view settings effect in there. That's certainly in the My menu. I can't remember if it's in the function menu as well. So those things that I'm using a lot, I put them in those menus. And I think that's probably a more important customization than feeling that there's some magic setting that's going to allow you to do. But as general advice to people, I think what you want to have in those easy to find places are the things that are not easy to find in the camera menus, that you are likely to want to change in the middle of dive. So as a mirrorless photographer, things that I want to change is I like to be able to turn the automatic reviewing of pictures on and off. As a normal underwater photographer shooting flash, I want to see my pictures as soon as I took them, because I know what the composition is, but I do not know what my light looks like until I take a picture. So I generally have my camera showing me my pictures as I shoot them. However, if I do a dive that's all action, I don't want pictures flashing up in my face all the time. I want to just keep shooting. If I'm doing a dive that's all available light shooting, I don't need to review my pictures. I'll have the settings effect on the viewfinder, and I'll see my composition and I'll see my exposure before I shoot. So in those situations, I'll turn that auto review off, and then I can just concentrate on shooting. Other things that I generally want in there is that ability to access settings effect as well, just because, again, I'll generally, as an underwater photographer, you have settings effect off, because otherwise you try and take a macro picture and it's completely black through the viewfinder. So you have that off. But if you go to available light only shooting, then you probably want that on, because then you don't need to review. You're seeing exactly the exposure before you press the shutter. And particularly for more interesting compositions like the view out from a cave, in that situation, knowing you've got the cave edges really black and the water the perfect exposure, that can be really valuable for that. So I would say those things are actually more important than having, an easy to reach custom button for key camera features. But the things that you may want to consider is you want to have, on some cameras, you might want to reposition your ISO button because it's easy to reach. You might want to reposition the ability to go into the focus modes because they're easy to reach. If you have the option, which a lot of Nikon cameras do, flash off is a really valuable one to have on a nice, neat custom button. And then you might want to have a flash mode on there if you switch regularly between front curtain and rear curtain flash. And those are things that I think are important. So it's just a case of thinking, what are the things that I would I do use a lot, or I would like to use more? And they're the kind of things to put them there. But I think you don't want to make things difficult for yourself by, if you change everything, then you've got a lot to learn. And if you're not shooting the camera very much, that's probably going to end up being pretty counterproductive.
Yeah, because even the few settings I have, and the flash mode was another one that I have set that I forgot about, between rear and front. But even those like 3 or 4 customizations I have, when I first had them set, and then I have the camera in the housing, I was pressing the wrong buttons constantly. So if you have every button set for something else, it is not going to be intuitive, and it's going to take a while to figure it out. So like you said, simplicity is often better. and just set those ones that you know you use frequently, or you change frequently underwater. Make sure those ones are accessible. You don't need to have everything that your camera does set to a specific custom button, because chances are you won't use them that frequently and you'll just end up confusing yourself more.
Yeah. So one thing that one of the photographers who came on my last Red Sea workshop had done with her housing is she'd actually
Oh,
printed out mini labels. And so all the custom buttons that she had changed on her housing, she'd actually made little labels for and put them on the back of her housing, which I thought was quite a good way of getting around it. So rather than a button saying C1, she had it saying, flash mode or
yeah.
whatever it was. And I think that was quite a neat solution. And then that way, that's her camera stays set up like that. And, the housing is labeled as well. And she'd just done it with one of those little waterproof sticker printers.
Yeah.
Just little bits of text. It actually looked quite cool. I did take a photo of it, so if I can find it, it'll be on screen while we're talking about this bit, and you can see that as a solution. So I'd say that is also very helpful advice if you are thinking of going down the route of customization. Remember, you can label the outside of the housing. But I would also say one thing we didn't say at the beginning is that not only do Nikon, Canon, Sony think about where you want your buttons, a lot of the housing manufacturers also think very carefully about what buttons would want to use. For example, Nauticam, they've, on all their housings, they have the replay button set very neatly under your left thumb. So you're shooting away, you want to see the picture, you want to review the picture, you just hit that button. On the Sony, it's actually on the other side of the housing,
Yeah.
on the other side of the camera, underneath the screen. And whenever I take pictures out of the water, which is pretty rare, I could never find it. I was like, where the hell is this button? Why is it in such a stupid place? But yeah, so I think the housing manufacturers have put a lot of thought as well into giving you access to those controls. But yeah, think about which controls fall easy to your fingers. And if there are important things that you want to change regularly and easily underwater, you can often customize those important buttons to do exactly what you want.
So I'm sure we could keep nerding out about this for a long time, but hopefully that was relatively short and concise. We are not known for short and concise episodes, but hopefully you guys made it through this whole one, found it a little bit useful, bared with me through this wall, and we will see you guys in the next episode of the Underwater Photography Show.